Hello and welcome to Lesson 1 in our Charles Bargue in the 21st Century Drawing course. We have two history segments, Lesson 1 and Lesson 2, and then we'll get along to the actual drawing of the Bargue plate. What is an atelier or academy school? It came to our attention that many art teachers in today's K-12 classrooms have not had access to the training methods taught at atelier schools. The word atelier developed in France and refers to a small specialized art school, usually with a single master instructor. However, even though the training techniques taught at the larger schools were in general the same methods when the schools became larger, they were called academy schools and tended to have multiple instructors and sometimes multiple locations. Although the word has specific meaning when discussing 19th century France, it is widely used today to refer to any school that teaches the same types of training techniques as were taught in these specialized schools. This method of concentrated, skill-based technical art training first developed in the late Middle Ages, early Renaissance, and was used as the primary form of studio art education throughout Europe and later America, all the way through the 19th century into the early 20th century, before it was abandoned almost completely. Atelier training, which originally started as apprenticeships and developed into guilds, small schools, and eventually large national schools during the 18th and 19th centuries, was a type of training that almost all of the most famous Old Master and 19th century artists would have had, which is what enabled them to create accurate, realistic imagery, shadow and form, including anatomy and the human figure. This was the method learned and used by artists such as Michelangelo, Botticelli, Leonardo da Vinci, Rembrandt, all the way through to Sargent, Bouguereau, Jerome, Alma Tadema, Lord Leighton, Henry Ossawa Tanner, Rosa Bonheur, and even artists such as Monet, Degas, and Van Gogh. Whether in France, England, Germany, Italy, Spain, America, or anywhere else in the Western world during the 1800s, the entire nature and way in which art was taught was different than how it is taught in most schools today. This is not surprising since the full rigorous atelier program was a 3 to 5 year full-time endeavor. However, there are many important lessons in drawing, painting, geometry, and literature that were regularly taught in these intensive programs that can be adapted for today's K-12 classrooms in a way that will teach students visual literacy and a deep appreciation for the visual arts. It is the hope of the Da Vinci Initiative to recapture many of the lessons learned by humanity in the visual arts from the Renaissance through the 19th century and adapt them for K-12 education in ways that meet 21st century art standards and the needs of the modern classroom. For the purpose of our second online course, Charles Bargue in the 21st Century Classroom, we want to give a brief overview of what a 3 to 5 year program would consist of in a 19th century atelier. In the 19th century atelier model, the first 1 or 2 years would be dedicated solely to drawing. Students would start with simple concepts such as notating the general boundaries of the items one wishes to depict so that they fit properly on the paper or canvas in advance of starting work. After this, the student would move on to depictions of rational space and lighting. This would often be done through drawing primary shapes in a still life. Observational drawings would be taught in a similar fashion that we teach it in the DVI's first online course, where objects can be depicted in accurate proportions, but not necessarily at the same size as the original. And sight size was also introduced as a method by which artists measure to make sure they are depicting the desired object at the exact same size on paper as it is in life. Next, students would move on to pencil or charcoal cast drawings, the goal of which was to take 3D objects that can be easily depicted in shades of gray to eliminate the complexity of color and translate them into 2D accurately to give the appearance of the 3D object when on paper. After students mastered this, they would then move on to anatomy, which included muscular and skeletal drawings, and life drawing that would be done from a live, generally nude model who would hold long and short poses. Unlike most schools today who offer life drawing where a long pose is an hour, long poses in the 19th century would go on for days or weeks, with the model taking breaks but always returning to take the same pose again and again, so that students had time to perfect their drawing and deepen their insight into the hidden nuances of the human form. It was only after the skill of drawing was mastered that students would be allowed to work in paint and color. Students would now need to relearn what they had learned in drawing, but in the new medium of paint. Students, when starting with paint, would use an en-grisage palette, meaning in shades of gray. This would give time for students to understand the new medium without the extra complication of color. after which, when color was introduced, their education would be expanded to understanding terms like hue, the base color, value, how light or dark the color is, and chroma, an understanding of color saturation. When first working with color, it was not uncommon to use a limited color palette to make the learning process less complicated. This might consist of a cast painting in which the cast would still be in primarily shades of gray, but with a single colored piece of cloth such as a solid green scarf. They would also study the essentials of a scumble, which is a thin opaque layer of paint to give a softer effect, and glazing, a light transparent layer of paint over an underlying opaque layer, intended to give depth and richness. During the 20th century, there were those who criticized the atelier methods of the 19th century because they observed that many students' works tended to look the same as all the other graduating students when the student had finished the program. This was taken as a sign that the artist's natural voice has been altered to match the voices of others or of their teachers. However, when something is accurately depicted, it will look the same as the original object. So when someone has learned this method and has only done student work, the work will naturally look quite similar. It was only after the skills had been learned that an atelier or academy student could start creating their own original work and develop their own voice. This generally occurred in their last year with a diploma painting or an exhibition, and often was not fully achieved until several years of professional experience. The goal of the school was to teach visual literacy so that a student could look at the world around them and be able to break it down visually into its core elements, combining them with fine motor control and eye-hand coordination so that the student could recreate the elements he or she wished, whether it be lighting, geometric form, contour accuracy, balance and composition, or subtle shifts in value. For example, Anthony van Dyck trained under Peter Paul Rubens and was one of his chief assistants. But today, people do not confuse the personal voice of the two artists, and in fact, their styles are quite distinctive. Academy or atelier training is skill-based education in the visual fine arts. And just like teaching rhythm, tempo, and scales in music class so that a student has the basic abilities to then compose his or her own music, by learning solid draftsmanship, color theory, paint handling, and perspective, students can expand their own abilities to visually express themselves and to create their own unique artwork. By mastering the skills that artists have passed down from generation to generation, students are prevented from erroneously using their energy to constantly reinvent the wheel, to learn concepts that are already known. Instead, atelier training allows students to discover truly new frontiers in visual literacy by having amassed the knowledge of previous generations and being able to build upon them. It was considered important that artists not be held back by the inability to execute a painting in the manner they wished, simply because they did not have the necessary training and acquired skills to do so. Artists like Van Gogh and Picasso were famous for learning these methods and deciding to paint in ways that went outside the normal atelier model. But having learned the solid foundation of atelier training, it would have influenced their thought process and ability to visually analyze the world around them. It gave them additional tools on which they could use as much or as little as they saw fit in order to achieve the end result they wanted in their finished work. To quote John Angel, one of the great living masters and teachers of skill-based art today, "There is a lot of talk about breaking rules, but there are no rules. There are, however, principles. If you do this with color or charcoal, this realistic visual effect will result. If you do this other with color or charcoal, this other will result. Like the principle of gravity, there is no way around this. One must learn to work with it to attain one's goal." This concludes Lesson 1. In our next lesson, we'll be looking at the 19th century art world, and then we will go on to the drawing portion of this course.